We know Saladin as the invincible one, the unifier of Islam, the genius of Châtillon, the man whom even Richard the Lionheart could not defeat. But what if I told you that there was only one man whom Saladin actually feared, one commander who inflicted the most humiliating defeat of his entire life upon him? That man turned out to be a 16-year-old youth, a teenager who could not feel his own right hand, a young man whose face and body were slowly decomposing while he was still alive from leprosy. His name was Baldwin IV, and as long as he drew breath, Saladin could not take Jerusalem. Prepare yourselves for the most tragic story of the Crusades. Today, you will learn how a 16-year-old Leper King at the head of 500 knights attacked 26,000 of Saladin's elite warriors and forced the Sultan to flee for his life on a racing camel. You will witness his final campaign, how Baldwin, already blind and unable to walk, ordered himself to be carried into battle on a litter, and how the mere sight of him turned Saladin's army to flight, and why his real war was not fought against Saladin. It unfolded inside his own court, against the very people, Raynald of Châtillon and Guy de Lusignan, who, a year after his death, would lead the kingdom to absolute catastrophe. This is not a biography. This is a race against death. Every year, the disease took a part of his body, but every year, as long as he breathed, he remained the sole barrier against a united Islam. We have seen the teacher, Nur ad-Din, who forged the sword. We have seen the student, Saladin, who struck the blow. We have seen the hero, Richard, who parried it. Today, you will see the shield. This is the story of Baldwin IV, the tragedy of a king who defeated every enemy except his own body and the stupidity of his heirs. The year is 1174. This year marks the breaking point for the entire Middle East. On May 15th, according to the Chronicles, Nur ad-Din Zingi dies, and Saladin in Egypt begins his heirs gambit. But just 2 months later, on July 11th, his chief adversary dies in Jerusalem, King Amalric I. The kingdom freezes in terror. The heir, Baldwin, is only 13 years old, and the court already knows a terrible secret. His tutor, the historian William of Tyre, had noticed it a few years earlier. The boy, while playing with his peers, felt no pain when they scratched or pinched his right arm. At first, they thought it was stoicism, but the diagnosis proved to be far more terrifying: leprosy. In the 12th century, this meant not just a diagnosis, but a sentence, a living death, a mark of God's curse. Lepers were cast out from society. They were forced to wear a bell to warn of their approach. And yet, on July 15, 1174, this 13-year-old boy, whose body had already begun its journey toward decomposition, is crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He becomes Baldwin IV. At the very moment when Saladin begins to assemble an empire to destroy Jerusalem, the holy city acquires a doomed, sick child as its king. Most of the barons of the kingdom saw him only as a temporary figure. They did not expect him to live to see 20. They immediately began gnawing at each other for the regency and for the right to marry his sister, Sibylla, in order to inherit the throne. The entire politics of the kingdom turned into a waiting game for his death. They were all mistaken. Assuming the disease was a weakness, they miscalculated. It was precisely this affliction that became his greatest strength. Baldwin knew he had no time. He could not afford the luxury of intrigue or long preparation. He had to act now. So Saladin begins the war for Syria in 1174, confident that Jerusalem, being under the rule of a sick teenager, poses no threat. He is occupied with Aleppo and Mosul. But the 13-year-old Baldwin acts proactively. He understands that Saladin is an existential threat. At just 14 years old, he cancels the regency and takes power. At 15 years old, he launches his first campaign to lift the siege of Damascus. Yes, he defends the son of Nur ad-Din against Saladin, attempting to maintain the schism within the Islamic world. While constantly in motion, he builds fortresses and repels raids. By 1177, Saladin finally decides that it is time to finish off this sick boy. He has concluded his business in Syria and gathered a massive army, 26,000 elite warriors, including his personal guard of Mamluks. He invades the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His plan is not just a raid, it is annihilation. Baldwin IV is only 16 years old. He has no army. All he can muster is 500 knights, including the Templars and the scandalously notorious Raynald of Châtillon, and a few thousand infantrymen. Saladin despises this handful so much that he doesn't even consider them a threat. He marches straight for Jerusalem, spreading out his army and pillaging villages along the way. Baldwin IV, the 16-year-old Leper King, decides that the only chance is not defense. It is an attack. He leads his 500 knights to cut off Saladin's 26,000-strong army. This was not simply risky, it bordered on suicide. November 25, 1177. Saladin is positioned near the hill of Montgisard, not far from Ramla. His army is stretched out, relaxed, and busy looting. He knows that 16-year-old Baldwin is trapped in Ascalon with a handful of knights. There is no threat. In his mind, he is already taking Jerusalem. But Baldwin did not sit locked away. He was waiting. Breaking out of Ascalon and executing a desperate march, he outflanked Saladin's army, and now, from the hill, he looked down upon the unsuspecting enemy. He had, by various estimates, between 375 to 500 knights, 80 of whom were Templars, and a few thousand infantry. Saladin had 26,000 elite warriors. There were no odds in his favor. Baldwin dismounted. He fell to his knees before a fragment of the true cross. He prayed for victory. And when he rose, the entire army saw the face of their 16-year-old king, already disfigured by disease, but burning with fury. He gave the order: attack. It did not look like a tactical maneuver, but rather the battering ram strike of a berserker. 500 knights, led by Baldwin, whose unfeeling right hand was tied to the reins while his left gripped a sword, slammed straight into the center of Saladin's army. The effect was not military, it was psychological. Saladin's army, not expecting an attack, let alone such a suicidal one, wavered. Seeing the leper fanatic king charging at them, they broke. Panic ensued, which grew into a slaughter. The heavy cavalry of the Franks tore Saladin's elite troops to pieces. The Sultan's personal guard, the Mamluks, were almost completely wiped out trying to save their master. Saladin himself barely escaped death. He fled. He fled so fast that, according to legend, he had to cross the desert on a racing dromedary camel. What happened became not just a defeat, but total destruction. He lost 90% of his army. He lost his reputation. A 16-year-old sick boy had trampled the greatest commander of Islam. Baldwin IV returned to Jerusalem an absolute hero, becoming a living legend, the miracle worker king. Saladin was shattered. Montgisard became such a painful and humiliating lesson for him that he left Jerusalem alone for many years, realizing that a frontal attack was useless while this leper king was alive. He returned to Syria and Egypt to lick his wounds and gather strength. It would seem, here it is, triumph. But victory merely preceded tragedy. Baldwin had won the war with Saladin, but he began to lose the war with his own body. The disease progressed relentlessly. By the age of 20, he began losing his eyesight. His hands and feet became covered in ulcers. He could no longer sit firmly in the saddle. And while the king weakened physically, his court rotted from the inside. The war party, led by Raynald of Châtillon and the Grand Master of the Templars, demanded new attacks. The peace party, led by Raymond of Tripoli, demanded negotiations. But the main problem became his sister, Cybele. Baldwin desperately needed a successor. He needed a strong husband for his sister who could accept the crown. And in 1180, he arrives at court. A handsome, charming, but catastrophically talentless aristocrat from Poitou, Guy de Lusignan. Baldwin despised him from the start, seeing his inner weakness. But under pressure from his mother and the factions, he made his major mistake. He allowed Cybele to marry him. Believing he was buying an ally, in reality, he signed the kingdom's death warrant.
So Baldwin IV is the hero of Montgisard, a living legend. But Saladin, recovering from the shock, changes tactics. Abandoning frontal attacks, the Sultan begins a war of attrition. He launches raids, burns crops, attacks border fortresses, and Baldwin is forced to respond. Year after year, he leads the army into the field, but his body betrays him. By 1180, he can barely stay in the saddle. By 1182, he begins to go blind. His hands are mutilated. He cannot hold a sword. Power is slipping through fingers he can no longer feel. And his court, seeing this, explodes. Guy de Lusignan, the husband of his sister Cybele, whom Baldwin appointed regent in case of his incapacity, turns out to be exactly who Baldwin thought he was: weak, indecisive, and arrogant. In 1182, Raynald of Châtillon, that very catalyst of war from the castle of Carac, once again violates the truce and loots caravans. Saladin is furious. Baldwin, already bedridden, orders Guy de Lusignan, his regent, to gather the army and punish Raynald. Guy refuses, fearing Raynald and unwilling to lose an ally. For Baldwin, this was the final straw. He realizes that Guy de Lusignan is a catastrophe, that this man must never become king. Summoning the remnants of his will, Baldwin does the impossible. He removes Guy from the regency. He forces the barons to swear allegiance to his 5-year-old nephew, Baldwin V, Cybele's son from her first marriage. He tries to strike Guy out of the line of succession. In a rage, he forces Cybele to annul the marriage with Guy. She refuses. The kingdom is split. While Saladin gathers the greatest army in history at the borders, the court of Jerusalem is at war with itself. Baldwin IV, a blind, bedridden 23-year-old king, is fighting his last, most desperate battle, not against Saladin, but against his own family. Autumn 1183. Saladin sees this chaos. He sees the schism. He knows Baldwin is dying. He decides that the time has come. Gathering a new massive army, he crosses the Jordan and invades the kingdom. This time, his target is the fortress of Carac, the nest of Raynald of Châtillon. He is coming to punish the provocateur. It was a perfect plan. The king of Jerusalem is dying. The regent, Guy de Lusignan,
who were supposed to command the army, has shown his complete incompetence and cowardice. The army is demoralized. In Jerusalem, there is panic. Guy de Lusignan, commanding the army, is afraid to give battle. And then happens something that the chroniclers refuse to believe. Baldwin IV, 24 years old, blind, unable to move either hand or foot, issues an order. I will lead the army myself. His courtiers are horrified. This borders on madness, but the king is adamant. He takes command away from Guy de Lusignan. He orders a special litter to be built, and the blind, dying king, rotting alive, is carried at the head of his army. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marches out on campaign. The vanguard is occupied not by banners, but by a litter. Upon it, sheltered from the sun by a canopy, lies the 24-year-old Baldwin IV. He is blind. His body is covered in ulcers. He cannot move, but he is here. When news of this reaches Saladin's camp, which is besieging Kerak, his soldiers are struck with terror. Expecting to see the cowardly Guy de Lusignan and an army without a leader, they were mistaken. Instead, before them stood the living dead, the ghost of Montgisard. The king who, in their opinion, should have died long ago, had risen from the grave to lead the army into a suicidal attack once again. The move turned out to be brilliant from a psychological perspective. Baldwin turned his greatest weakness, his disease, into his greatest weapon. His army, seeing his will, was ready to die for him. Saladin's army, seeing him, was paralyzed by superstitious fear. Saladin, the great commander, the victor, looked at this. He saw the fanatical determination of the Franks. He remembered the slaughter at Montgisard. He remembered how he fled, saving his life from this very boy. And he did not risk it. The Sultan evaded the battle. As soon as Baldwin's army approached, Saladin, citing bad weather and illness in the camp, simply lifted the siege and retreated. This was what victory looked like, an absolute, pure victory of will. Baldwin IV, blind, paralyzed, dying, put the greatest sultan of the era to flight without even drawing a sword. He returned to Jerusalem in triumph. This was his final campaign. He had defeated Saladin. He had defeated Guy de Lusignan, but he could no longer defeat his body. Upon returning to Jerusalem, Baldwin IV finally took to his deathbed. The monarch had done everything possible. He forced the barons to officially crown his 5-year-old nephew, Baldwin V, making him co-ruler. He appointed Raymond of Tripoli as regent, the leader of the peace party, and the only man he trusted. Having officially stripped Guy de Lusignan of all rights to the throne, he took every measure to save the kingdom after his death. On March 16, 1185, Baldwin IV, the Leper King, died. He was 24 years old. He had been dying for 11 years, and for all those 11 years, he remained the only barrier between Saladin and Jerusalem. Little Baldwin V sat on the throne. The regent, Raymond, immediately concluded a new 4-year truce with Saladin. Saladin, respecting the will of the late king and still fearing the Franks, agreed. It seemed Baldwin IV's strategy had worked. The kingdom was safe. But he didn't account for one thing. He didn't account for fate. Just a year later, in the summer of 1186, the little 8-year-old king, Baldwin V, suddenly fell ill and died. Baldwin IV's strategy crumbled into dust. In that very second, Sibylla, her sister, and her husband, Guy de Lusignan, staged a coup. They seized Jerusalem. The war party, Guy de Lusignan and Raynald de Châtillon, came to power. Summer of 1186. The little king, Baldwin V, is dead. In that instant, the entire complex system of checks and balances that Baldwin IV had spent 11 years building
collapsed. Regent Raymond of Tripoli, who tried to preserve peace, was in Nablus. Sibia, Baldwin IV's sister, and her husband, Guy de Lusignan, were in Jerusalem. The conspirators acted with lightning speed. Sibia claimed her rights to the throne, but there was a problem. The patriarch and the barons hated her husband, Guy. They agreed to crown her only on one condition. She had to annul her marriage to Guy, with the right to choose a new husband. Sibia agreed. She was crowned. And then, as soon as the crown touched her head, she was asked to choose a new husband. And she, standing before the entire court, declared, "I choose you, Guy." And she placed a second crown upon his head. A brilliant, audacious political drama played out. The coup succeeded. The one whom Baldwin IV despised and removed from power ascended the throne of Jerusalem, and his closest ally became Raynald of Châtillon. The war party got everything. Regent Raymond, realizing he had been betrayed, committed the unthinkable in desperation. He concluded a separate peace with Saladin. He preferred an alliance with a Muslim sultan to an alliance with a Christian king. The kingdom was shattered. Saladin watched this and waited. He was still bound by the truce he had concluded with Raymond. He just needed a reason. And Raynald of Châtillon, as is known, provided that reason. At the end of 1186, he attacked that very caravan. All of Baldwin IV's achievements over 11 years of suffering, all his victories, all his pain, all his brilliant strategy, turned out to be destroyed by this single act of insane greed. Less than a year later, Guy de Lusignan's army would be annihilated at Châtillon. For 11 years, Baldwin IV achieved the impossible. A youth rotting alive defeated Saladin and death itself, buying time for a kingdom that did not deserve him. The truth is paradoxical. Having won the war against the greatest commander of the East, he lost the battle against his own family. For even titanic will is powerless against human stupidity, and a shield cannot protect forever if there are traitors standing behind it. And this truth became a bloody sentence for the Holy Land, the echo of which is heard to this day. But Baldwin's death was merely the signal for the beginning of the end. As soon as the shield fell, a man stepped onto the stage who became his complete opposite. Not a defender, but a destroyer, a mad adventurer whose greed and cruelty single-handedly pulled the trigger of the apocalypse, destroying the entire legacy of the Leper King in a single day. His name is Raynald of Châtillon, and what he commits will become a crime that history has not forgiven him for to this day. Subscribe to see the face of true evil. Like if Baldwin's courage astounded you. And comment, did Jerusalem have any hope without him? Thank you. See you in the next episode.